Hello and welcome to the ultimate game, to the game of life. I call it the UGGL, Ultimate Game, Game of Life. You see, the ultimate game is actually life itself. And I would like to invite you to come along with me on this journey. I want you to play along. You see, I realized that life itself is the ultimate game because it's the one game none of us can afford to lose. I'm actually a philosopher. And until I came along, there was no universal definition for game because so many games are so different to each other that we seem to understand what a game is, but we didn't understand what connected all games together. For example, the game of chess. How is that related to the game of football, soccer, if you want to call it that, or basketball? What about playing mums and dads? What about play fighting when kids play fight? What about when people are flirtatious? What about when people play with themselves? We call it masturbation, but yet these are all types of games. So what brings all these games together? As a philosopher, I argue that brings all games together is life, because every single game is actually an imitation of an aspect of real life. So for example, chess imitates the kinds of considerations generals make on the battlefield or preparing for battle. You know, moms and dads prepares little girls for motherhood and little boys for fatherhood. Playing with yourself, masturbation, prepares you for the act of reproduction. Basketball, football, soccer, they prepare you for the battlefield. Because you see, in the past, our ancestors would have a lot of fights, maybe within the family, maybe between groups of neighbors, maybe groups of friends, or even between different villages. People would fight in small groups. So basketball, soccer, American football, these games, they kind of imitate the act of small groups of people going into physical battle with primitive weapons like swords, bows and arrows. Yet, even the practice of watching sports itself can be traced to our evolution because back in the day, people would stand around and crowd when they saw conflict. We do it today. If there's a conflict between family members, between friends, between a random group of individuals in the street, we just crowd around them and we watch what happens. And the excitement of real life, real events happening, we have taken that and created sports and created stadiums and created television and media, which give us the same effect that our ancestors had in the past when they stood around and just watched people have physical fights in the streets or arguments. We still do that today. So my conclusion was that actually games are imitations of real life. And we play games in preparation for the real thing. Because if you can prepare for the real thing, practice in a safe environment, when the real thing actually happens, there's a greater chance that you're going to succeed. So if you play fight as a child, one day you grow up and have a fight with someone, you're more likely to win because you've been preparing for years. You've been playing sports. One day you could be called into the army. You know, it's better to have an army full of footballers and basketball players than an army of idle people who don't take part in sports. So from that perspective, life is the ultimate game because every other game is but an imitation of a small section or a small aspect of life. Not long ago, about 100 years ago, philosophers developed the philosophy of game theory. Game theory is when you use mathematical principles to understand the best way to win a game. So with game theory, you can find optimal strategies, the strategies that are more likely to succeed. So for example, a famous game theory scenario is called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. It seems quite complicated when you go and study the prisoner's dilemma in detail, but I'll simplify it for you. The end result of the prisoner's dilemma concludes that the best strategy for playing the prisoner's dilemma is to cooperate with others, to work with them, as opposed to try to outdo them and compete against them. And that's a very general simplification of the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is about two prisoners who get arrested. So the officers make them an offer, you know. The conclusion is if they accept the offer that cooperates the best with the police, they're going to get the least amount of time in prison. But yet we play a prisoner's dilemma every day in society. You see, from a game theoretical perspective, right, there are two basic survival strategies in the game of life. We either cooperate with each other, which means that we work together, or we compete, we defect. Defection is the opposite of working together. But when we defect, we fall out, we compete against each other, and it ends in war, and war ends in people killing each other. So as you can see throughout history, human beings, we're either working together or we're going to war with each other. Most of us prepare working together because it's peaceful. And although you may not get the highest reward from working with others, at least the reward is guaranteed. Like, for example, you could rob a bank, you could defect and compete with others. And if you succeed, right, you will become rich. But if you fail, you go into jail for life, or you might die in the process, right? It's the same as the prisoner's dilemma, right? So most of us, we cooperate with society. We follow the rules. We don't rob the bank. And it means we can't get rich in one instant overnight. But at the same time, it means we don't get sent to prison for the rest of our lives, or we don't die trying to get rich quickly. So most of us choose the middle strategy. The middle strategy is the Goldilocks region. You see, there was a philosopher and his name was Aristotle. And Aristotle realized that the optimal place to be in anything in life is always in the middle. He called it a virtue. So if you're familiar with the term that patience is a virtue, Aristotle created a whole book about virtues. And he was the one who founded the idea of ethics, how we should behave. So patience is a virtue because patience is actually in the middle, in the Goldilocks region. Patience is the difference between quick to anger, getting angry quickly, or the failure to get angry. So Aristotle argued that the two extremes are bad because sometimes you should get angry, but there are times when you shouldn't get angry. So if someone's disrespecting you and you fail to get angry, perhaps you won't stand up for yourself. So that in itself is not good. But when someone looks at you the wrong way and you get angry quickly, now you're going to start a conflict. That's not good either. So the best place to be is in the middle. Patience. Just be patient and wait for things to clear out themselves. And this is what is meant by patience is a virtue. And from that, Aristotle developed the ethics that the Western world follows to this very day, trying to find that middle ground. So the Goldilocks region. So the story of Goldilocks, she prefers the porridge when it's not too hot or not too cold. She prefers the bed that is not too hard, not too soft. Prefers the chair that's not too big and not too small. The story of Goldilocks is based on on Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, which is the fact that the middle is the best place to be. So the middle is a virtue. That being said, if you translate the word virtue to English, although we do have the word virtue in English, virtue actually means excellence. So excellence and virtue mean the same thing. So if you want to achieve excellence in anything, then you want to be in the middle. So being in the middle tends to be where most of us are. We are cooperating with each other. Most of the time, we're not committing crimes trying to kill each other. But at the same time, when people need our help, most of the time we do help. So an extreme would be someone who's violent all the time, right? That's an extreme. But then someone who doesn't like to help other people, he doesn't help in the workplace, doesn't help at home. He may not be violent and be attacking people, but he just refuses to cooperate. So there's two ways to refuse to cooperate. You can refuse to cooperate by doing nothing, or you can refuse to cooperate by being violent. Most of us choose the middle option. the Goldilocks region, the mean, right? And that's where we find excellence and virtue, because societies in which people work together are far more successful than societies in which there is chaos because everyone's killing each other, trying to make it all the way to the top. So from that, in my book, I connect modern game theory to philosophy and demonstrate that actually game theory has always been part of philosophy. It's just that it had never been formalized mathematically until 100 years ago. So now that we can understand game theory with numbers, we can more easily make sense of all the philosophy that has ever been written, because we can apply these numbers, these game theoretical scenarios to philosophy. And this is exactly what my book is all about. Virtuous Circles, The Secret to Power and Success. Game Theory, Nietzsche's Philosophy of the Future. You see, just over 100 years ago, Friedrich Nietzsche tried to understand what good and evil was. And he rejected the notion that there was a God deciding what good was and deciding what evil was. He said that there had to be a rational explanation. So in his book, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, Nietzsche anticipates that one day there will come a philosopher and he will have a philosophy of the future that could explain good and evil. As it goes, it happens that that philosopher is me, and this is the book. You could call it a prophecy or just a simple prediction. It's all just language games, isn't it? And it's important to understand that, because in the spiritual realm, right, in the world of religion, there has been many people who created prophecies, and they were the prophets. Yet, if you think about it carefully, as I argue in my book, the spiritual men of the past, they were actually just philosophers. And and their prophecies were actually just predictions. It's just that spirituality and religion are far older than philosophy, right? So we had the first spiritual systems and they developed into the first religions, right? But then as the religious leaders began to learn mathematics, they developed a new type of religion called philosophy. Because with mathematics, with numbers, we're able to prove that something is true or false. So that little innovation is what took religion and evolved it into philosophy. So philosophers from the beginning understood that some things were true and some things were false. Yet those are the principles of mathematics. And it's important to understand this because the first philosophers created mathematics. So mathematics has always been part of philosophy. If you think of Pythagoras, Pythagoras' theorem allows us to use mathematics to work out what angles on a triangle should be, because Pythagoras believed that the world was ultimately mathematical. Now, when you trace that to the modern world, you realize that physics is actually just philosophy. Physics traces its origins all the way to the ancient philosophers 2,500 years ago. Yet, game theory has only been around for 100 years. With game theory, you can now connect philosophy, mathematics, physics. Anyway, before I run too long, because the information is all in my book, right? The game of life. If we understand game theory and how to win games of strategy, if we reverse engineer it, it teaches us how to actually approach life. Because, for example, if you understand how to win a game of chess, you're more likely to win a battle as a general in a real life field. If you understand the game of poker, you're more likely to be able to read other people's intentions and learn how to negotiate with others so that you can make good deals in everyday life. And this is why I've decided to approach life like life itself is an actual game, right? And it's interesting because if you think about the concept of money, money is just like a video game. Imagine Mario and he's collecting coins. But we kind of do the same thing ourselves, don't we? When we go to work, we collect coins. But some people figure out how to collect bigger coins and acquire and accumulate more. So if we start to apply game theory to life, we should be able to further our lives and be more successful just because we are applying it like a game. As a result, I've decided to go out to the world and play the game pretending that I'm Mario or Link in Zelda or Samus in Super Metroid. My 5 superpowers that I've been acquiring throughout the years is music. I can mix, master music, compose music, write music. Writing, I've just written my first book, finishing my second book, which is about my biography, because after writing a book like this, that Nietzsche anticipated would be the philosophy of the future, I thought it would be valuable to explain how I came up with that philosophy. The only way to do that is to write a biography, because Nietzsche believed that every philosophy is the perspective of a philosopher. This is called perspectivism. So by giving you my perspective as a person through my biography, you will more easily be able to understand how I arrived at Nietzsche's philosophy of the future. So Nietzsche wrote Beyond Good and Evil, prelude to a philosophy of the future. In simple terms, good and evil is just about power. See, whoever has the power decides the rules of the game of life, right? If you have the power, you write the laws of the land. When the Catholics had the power, they wrote the laws that everyone should follow. As time evolved, the church became separated from the state, and new governments evolved and they created new laws. So the church decided what was good and evil. The government now decides what is good and evil. But what Nietzsche noticed was that the values that the Catholics, Christians had were the inversion, the exact opposite of Roman values. He called it the transvaluation of all values. So he was confused because he said, why is something that is good to the Catholics bad to the Romans and vice versa? So because of that, he realized that Christian values didn't come from God. This is his argument. He said Christian values are just an inversion of Roman values. He said because the Romans persecuted the Christians, in order to fight back, what the Christians did, they took Roman values and they inverted them. And so the opposite of Roman values became the Christian values. And then when the Christian Catholics took over Rome, they completely turned the society upside down. And so we're living in an upside down world in which our values are the opposite of Roman values. So for example, because the Romans were conquerors, they just stole other people's lands, they killed whoever was there, they enslaved and they raped. And then they celebrated. To be a Roman would be to be a conqueror, right? But because the Christians were at the receiving end of this, they said killing is bad. For the Romans, they said killing is good. Because the Christians had no power, so they couldn't steal, they said stealing is bad. But the Romans said, no, you're a conqueror. You're supposed to steal. It's the survival of the fittest. You know, survival of the fittest is how biology drives living things. Game theory. You apply this, and it makes sense from a biological perspective because we see it now. The United States of America pretty much rules the world because they're the strongest. So we have to do what the Americans say. China is now rising and China has a different outlook on life. And so if China becomes the dominant power, we have to adopt the Chinese values. And so there is no good and evil. All there is power. And that's really the conclusion of my book, because whoever has the power decides what is good and evil. So if you lived in Rome, killing foreigners is good and stealing their land is good. Yeah. But if you lived now in a world with Christian values, killing people is wrong and stealing their stuff is wrong because those are the Christian values. Yet, in the future, whoever has the power will decide. They may change the rules. And so the rules, they're not coming to us from God anymore. They're coming from men. And we know that because we have presidents, prime ministers, and they vote on what the laws should be, right? And if you break the law from the perspective of the government, you are evil, you are bad, you will be sent to prison, or you might be killed or executed or lose all your money. But if you do whatever the government says, then they'll say that you're good, you can live freely, you will be allowed to accumulate wealth and pretty much do what you want. So in the modern world, we can pretty much do what we want if we follow the laws of those who rule us. But you see, the rules only apply to the weak. This is game theory again, because those who create the rules don't have to follow them because they have the power. And the power is basically the power to inflict violence. And those who don't have the power to inflict violence have to follow the rules, or the violence will be inflicted against them. So, for example, in the United States, it's illegal to kill people like in most developed nations, right? Because the government said so. But as soon as the government wants to kill people, they can just send their soldiers and armies abroad and kill whomever they want with impunity because they have the power. So, from a game theoretical perspective, those who have the power create the laws. And because they create the laws, can also break them since they are the creators. They play the role of God. Uh, those who don't have the power have to follow the laws. Otherwise, violence will be inflicted on them. Therefore, there is no good and evil. The only thing there is power, a world in which those who have power can do what they want. And those who don't have power, they either cooperate and do what they're told, or the consequences will be dealt against them. You see? So, Nietzsche predicted the philosophy of the future. I have the philosophy with me. He also spoke of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book in which the spiritual leader, Zarathustra, returns to the world with a new philosophy. And that philosophy is designed to free mankind. And Zarathustra is basically mocked by the world because they don't understand. People don't understand what he's trying to teach them. And so in the modern world, I am like Zarathustra in the sense that I have a new philosophy for the world, a philosophy designed to free mankind. Except that as much as I admire Nietzsche, I disagree with him in a lot of things. And the reason is because Nietzsche, he lived in a primitive time. So Nietzsche's conclusion of his time was that the world needs to create an Übermensch. An Übermensch is basically a super powerful hero, one individual, and that individual would have the virtue to set the world on the right path. So to Nietzsche, the ideal man would be Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar. And yet the idea is not that original because it's the same idea of Jesus Christ, one individual with superpowers, and he is supposed to free mankind. You see, the Nazis believed in Nietzschean philosophy, so the Nazis adopted Nietzsche's philosophy. And this is why Hitler rose the way that he rose, like an Übermensch with an iron fist, who didn't believe in good and evil. He believed in power, and so he was free to kill whomever he wanted because he believed that he was like a Roman. He adopted the Roman values of conquest. Yet Nietzsche died before the creation of the internet. And so philosophers, we're all kind of the same type of person. We write books and we read other people's books on ideas, and sometimes we add to these ideas, sometimes we dismiss these ideas, sometimes we come up with new ideas. And I have come up with a new idea. My argument is this: because of the creation of the internet, the Übermensch is no longer needed. We don't need Übermensch-like individuals who have absolute power and who tell the rest of us what to do. You see, human beings from the beginning, we have been trying to become more connected. So if you think about the creation of writing, writing allowed us to share ideas and pass them along. I learned ideas from others. But then, we created the postal system, we created the telegraph, the telephone, the mobile phone, and now the internet. With the internet, it's now possible for humanity in its entirety to be connected, right? And because we are connected, it allows human beings to behave like a single consciousness. If you think of the human brain, there's billions of neurons, right? And these neurons, they cooperate, you know, and they work together, just like in game theory. And when your neurons are cooperating, the person thinks in an optimal way. Sometimes our neurons are not cooperating, and you're experiencing thoughts that contradict each other. You're experiencing mental illness because your neurons are not connecting. They want to go. There are multiple ideas that are tearing your mind apart because they want to go in a different direction. So in your mind, when you have mental illness, it's like an internal battle inside your brain. But when your neurons cooperate, you can become an optimal thinker. You can achieve more in life. Yet, if you think about human beings, each one of us is actually like a single neuron. There are 8 billion human beings on the planet. And using the internet, we can actually cooperate with each other. We can improve cooperation. If you think about globalization, you know, it has achieved cooperation between all human beings, between 8 billion beings all at the same time. Because we cooperate with each other, you can see that our society is becoming more optimal in many ways. It's becoming better. We wouldn't have smartphones if you couldn't get billions of people around the world to cooperate. So the progress of humanity has come down to the fact that so many of us have been able to cooperate with each other, which means that humanity is actually like a brain. And this comes to my theory of reality. My theory of reality is that we live in a Russian doll, fractal-like nested reality in which there are nothing but brains inside brains inside brains. What is a brain? A brain is actually just a network of elements which cooperate with each other. So if you think about the human brain, it's a network of neurons that cooperate with each other, creating a network effect. The network effect is the individual, it's you. But if you think about humanity, humanity is also a network of individuals, a network of human beings who work together to allow the species to move forward. But then all living things, to an extent, they cooperate because all the cells of the plant cooperate. All plants cooperate. This is how we get rainforest. If you think about the world is a network of atoms which are cooperating together. You know, we may have different elements, gold, silver, hydrogen, but in the end, they're all just atoms, and these atoms are cooperating together. If you think of the solar system, it's planets cooperating with each other. The galaxy, you got planets and stars cooperating with each other. The universe, you have galaxies that are cooperating with each other. And the multiverse, you've got universes that are cooperating with each other. These are all networks of elements that cooperate with each other. But you see, you find these networks at different levels. So the multiverse would be like the largest network of universes cooperating with each other. Then you have the universe, then you have galaxies, solar systems, planets. In those planets, like Earth, you have life. Plant life would cooperate with each other. You have species who are cooperating with each other. You have members of the species, like human beings, are cooperating with each other. Then you have our neurons in our brains and cooperating with each other. All the cells in our body are cooperating with each other. The molecules are cooperating with each other. The atoms are cooperating with each other. The subatomic particles are cooperating with each other. So reality is really just brain within brain within brain within brain at different levels. So I think human beings and living things, what's special about us is that we find ourselves in the golden mean. Going back to Aristotle and ethics and going back to cooperation, because we are a brain that lies in the middle. We're not the biggest, we're not the smallest. We're the most capable of exercising free will. This is to say that we can more freely move around independently of the rest of the universe. See, the bigger that you are, if you're a large brain like the multiverse, it's harder to freely move around and function and cooperate. If you're super tiny like an atom or molecules, it's hard to have free will because you're so small. But us, because we're in the middle, we human beings, living things, we are basically where the super small and the super big meet each other. So we are at the meeting point right in the middle. And this is why we have the greatest level of consciousness. So what do I think consciousness is? I think consciousness is just the network of elements cooperating with each other. I think the consciousness is all there is. There's nothing about it that we can really understand in the sense that it has always been there. So then when people ask the question, why something instead of nothing? Well, nothing doesn't exist. So the option for nothing was never there in the first place. When you think of nothing, nothing is actually the absence of something in particular. So if you used to say there's no one inside that room, you're saying that people are absent from that room, but you're also postulating that people exist in the first place. So for there to be nothing, everything had to exist in the first place just so that you could have the concept of everything being missing. So there's no such thing as nothing. Everything has always been there. Anyway, studying history from a game theoretical perspective, there are patterns that occur throughout history. So what happens in the past repeats itself in the future. And so if we look at the past, humanity began in the Dark Ages. I call it the first Dark Age. The first Dark Age was human beings going from animals to highly intelligent, cultured beings. So the first Dark Age ends with the beginning of the first civilizations. See, if we go to the Sumerians, 4,000 years BC, and then the Egyptians, like 3,000 years BC, they created the first cities, the first systems of writing. They were the first to become enlightened. So they created the first enlightenment. And enlightenment, they allowed human beings to work together. Before that, in the Dark Ages, it was mostly just every man for themselves. There was no laws, there was no government. And so the first civilizations created the first religions and the first governments. They created the first religions and the first government simply because they wanted human beings to work together. If we all work together, our chances of survival increase. And ever since then, the human population has been growing exponentially until the first enlightenment. Human population was in the thousands. After the first enlightenment, the thousands became millions. And so what is enlightenment really? From a game theoretical perspective, and then there's a concept of a positive sum game. A positive sum game is basically when everyone works together, cooperates, and everyone wins. That's a positive sum game. A negative sum game is when we all go to war, and in the end, everyone loses because even though you might think that you have won, maybe you lost family members, maybe you lost a limb. So it's a negative sum game. If you follow it to the full conclusion, in a negative sum game, everyone dies. In a positive sum game, everyone flourishes and everyone does excellently. Yet there is a middle point between a negative sum game and a positive sum game, and that is a zero sum game. So in a zero sum game, it's basically you take one person's win and you take another person's loss and you add them up together and you get zero. So for example, if you have £1,000, you're in the positive. But if someone comes and steals your £1,000 because they have a minus £1,000, then they didn't make new money. They just stole your money. So now you have zero and now they have 1,000. So if you add up the plus 1,000 to the minus 1,000, you get zero. So zero sum game, they occur when people are not working together. Some are just taking from others. The first enlightenment, the first age of enlightenment that began with the Sumerians, ended with the Catholic Christians. If you think of history, the Romans were doing great things. Before them, the Greeks were doing great things. They were writing books. They created philosophy. You see, religion and government are actually the same thing, because in the past, the nations, the first civilizations, they were governed by religions. So if you think of the Roman Empire, it was the Catholic Roman Empire. If you think of the Egyptians, they had their Egyptian religion. And so a religion is actually just an ancient form of government. And a government is actually just a modern form of religion. And they are both religions because both of them create laws that the rest of us have to follow. They are both governments because they both govern over us. So humanity ended the first dark age with the arrival of the Sumerians. And then humanity flourished until Catholicism, Christian Catholicism, swept through Europe. And then we were returned to the second dark age. This is the dark ages that we know about, when the feudal systems emerged and the Roman Empire collapsed. The question is, why did the Roman Empire collapse? Well, the Roman Empire collapsed because as soon as the Catholics got to power, they realized that they had an enemy. The Christian Catholics had an enemy, and that enemy was the philosophers, right? And so comes the story of Socrates. See, Socrates, they call him the founder of Western religion. But yet, Socrates was put to death by his society. He was put to death for two reasons. For impiety, for being an atheist. They said, Socrates, you don't believe in the gods, so you are an atheist, therefore we will put you to death. But also for corrupting the youth. They said, Socrates, your ideas are corrupting our youth. The youth don't want to do what we tell them to do anymore. They want to think for themselves and ask stupid questions. We can't get the youth just to obey. So the Romans put Socrates to death. But Socrates, he was just a simple man who went out to the world and had conversations with people. Just like Jesus Christ just went out to the world, random people on the street, and had conversations with them. That spoke Zarathustra in Nietzsche's work. He just goes out to the world and just has conversations to them. Me, modern day philosopher, I have begun by copying the past. Not because I read it from the books, but because I realized the only way to connect with my society is actually to go out there, speak to people, and get my ideas across. Otherwise, my ideas are never going to change the world if they lie just in my head and I cannot share them with anyone. Yet Socrates, what he said wasn't very revolutionary. He basically asked people, so you believe in the gods, don't you? Who told you about the gods? And the more that he asked people, who told you about the gods? It turns out that people learn about the gods from other people in town. And if you follow the logic, it's like asking Mark, who told you about the gods? Mark said, oh, Matthew told me about the gods. Matthew, who told you about the gods? My mom told me about the gods. Let me ask his mom, who told you about the gods? And she's like, I just heard it around town. And the more that he asked, he said, but wait, has anyone ever seen a god? No, none of us have actually seen the gods, but we just know they're there. So he's like, but where's the evidence for this? Because it seems to me, Socrates was saying, that these stories are made up because there is no proof that the gods exist. No one has actually seen a god. And then when we ask people who told you about the gods, it's just other random people from around town. And everyone heard it from someone. So what if there are no gods? What if the gods were made up? The authorities were like, yep, that's it. Socrates, you see, religion is government, right? We tell people about religion, and because we have the authority, they trust us and they do what we tell them to do. But now that you're telling them, actually, these gods are made up, people the young don't want to do what we tell them to do. We can't tell them, do this because Apollo said so. They're like, well, there's no proof that Apollo exists. So this is ancient wokeism, if you really want. People are waking up. But wait, why should we do what you tell us to do based on the authority of Apollo when there is no proof that Apollo existed? So Socrates became a problem that had to be solved. They're like, we need to kill Socrates. Otherwise, if his ideas are spread throughout society, we're going to lose power since no one will do what we tell him to do because they will realize that we've never met the gods and that we have no proof that the gods exist. Therefore, we have no authority. In my book, I argue that the reason that human beings created the idea of God, God could exist. I'm not disputing that. I believe the universe is a supermassive brain that is somehow conscious, just like our brain. That's what I believe. And this is what people have referred to as God for millions of years, for thousands of years. But in terms of from a social perspective, the reason that we created the idea of God, I call it in my book, the problem of authority. You see, when you get a large group of people together, right, as was the case when the first Enlightenment arrived, then we have a problem. There's so many intelligent people and so many capable people. And if we are to cooperate with each other, we need a leader, right? So how do we solve the problem of authority? Who should lead us? This is a game theoretical problem. So I realized that there are multiple different options to solving the problem of authority. Who should have the authority? Sometimes we solve this problem because it occurs all the time with the strongest. Whoever is the strongest is the leader because he's stronger than us and we can't beat him in a fight. See, this is what governments do, and this is what religions do. They acquire military power, the power of violence, to give themselves authority so they can create the rules that the rest of us must follow. So you solve the problem of authority. One option is by being the strongest. Another option is by being the wisest. If you can prove that actually I'm the wisest, I know about farming, which means I can feed everyone here, then sometimes the wisest becomes the authority because they can feed everyone else. So you could solve the problem of authority by being the strongest, being the most violent, being the wisest. What about being the most knowledgeable? You could say, well, I'm a doctor. When everyone gets sick, I can fix their illnesses and I can make sure they survive. And then people say, maybe we should follow the doctor because he can save our lives. So if you look through society, there's various different people who have authority and we follow them because they have some sort of power over us. But then comes religion and says, well, if you look at all the religious books, you can say, well, I have knowledge of the gods. See, if you don't follow me, you're going to die and your soul will burn in hell forever. But if you follow me, because I've been given the law directly from the gods, then okay, maybe I can't solve the problems in this planet, but I can solve the problems in the afterlife, and the afterlife is forever. Isn't it better to have a good afterlife forever than to have a short life on earth? You can suffer on earth, it's fine. As long as you follow what I tell you to do, in heaven, you will live forever. And Nietzsche, he noticed this. He said, because the Romans were the kings of the world, when the Romans were suppressing the Christians said, actually, well, the Romans can have this physical world. We'll have the other world, the world after death. We'll be kings when we die. The Romans can be king in life, we'll be kings in death. So from Nietzsche's perspective, the Catholics, Christians created the notion of the afterlife because they were actually just inverting Roman ideals. They're taking Roman ideas and adopting the opposite. So when the Christian Catholics came into power, they had a problem because you see, the Romans, they didn't really create much in terms of culture. The Romans were just violent thugs. They didn't really write books. They didn't really have a philosophy, but they wanted to be refined. So the Romans went to Greece and they learned philosophy from the Greeks. So we had the Greek Empire. The Greeks, they got their philosophy from the Middle East. So the Greeks got their philosophy from the Egyptians from Mesopotamia. And so the first Enlightenment was a continuation. It spread from Mesopotamia to Egypt, to Greece, and to Rome. And so you had this line of ideas which saw religion, as human beings learned more, religion evolved into philosophy. And so the prophets were actually just ancient philosophers who created prophecies which are just predictions of what the future would be. We create predictions today of what the future should be. So philosophers and prophets are just the same thing, really. The and predictions and and prophecies, they're essentially the same thing. However, when the Christians got to power in Rome, they had a problem, since the Greek world was still influential in culture. You had all these philosophers in Greece, from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle, right? And so the oldest schools of philosophy in Greece were about 800 years old. Socrates died in around 400 BC. So 800 years later, you had the Roman Empire converted to Catholicism, right? And these Christians, they feared that actually they couldn't consolidate power because there were too many philosophers. There was just too many books of philosophy. And they were constantly being attacked, saying that your religion didn't come from God. There are no gods. You made it up just to rule us, right? But Christianity was very successful. It was successful because to understand philosophy, you have to be very educated. You basically have to go to the university. But most people didn't have the ability to go to school, to the university. The philosophers created the first universities. So most people were illiterate. So it was easier to adopt Christianity than to adopt philosophy, since Christianity is an ancient form of philosophy for uneducated people. All the religions are ancient forms of philosophy for uneducated people. And these ancient forms, they don't require you to understand. They just require you just to accept. So religions, they convince people just to do as they're told because those with the power were anointed by God. Read the books and memorize and follow, obey, be humble, but don't question the power. The philosophers were different. Actually, we want to question all the powers because you, the government, which is a religious government, you have no authority over us. Your claim to authority from God is false, it's fictitious. So, Emperor Constantine became the first Catholic emperor, and he adopted Christianity. He considered many different religions, not because he believed Christianity was the best, but because he saw that Christianity was spreading the quickest. And it was spreading the quickest because most people are uneducated and cannot understand the books. You know, they kept the books in Latin, in secret languages, so that people couldn't understand them for thousands of years. So the Catholics ordered the closure of all the schools of philosophy 800 years after the death of Socrates. All the many philosophers were killed. The philosophers then escaped to the east, to what would later become the land of the Muslims. They took their books with them. The Catholics burned all the books. And so, because they burned all the books and they closed all the universities, the Roman Empire collapsed. And this is the point of this long conversation. The Roman Empire collapsed not because it was defeated on the battlefield. The Roman Empire collapsed on purpose. It was collapsed on purpose. It collapsed because all the universities were closed. The philosophers, which were the teachers, were driven out. And so all there was left was a population of ignorant people who were badly educated and didn't understand the books, but they believed in the religion. And so the Christian Catholics, they brought about the second dark age on purpose. They returned the world to darkness on purpose for 1,000 years. It's important to understand that the modern day philosophers are actually just intellectuals. In every university, the highest qualification is a PhD. PhD means philosophy doctor. So every PhD is a doctor of philosophy. Doctor means teacher in Latin. So every PhD is a teacher of philosophy. In my book, I define philosophy as problem solving. There's not enough time to get into it, but a philosopher is just a problem solver, someone who studies problems and tries to find solutions. So the philosophers, when Socrates was put to death, his student Plato, see, Socrates didn't really have a school and he didn't really have formal students. The young men around town just followed him as he had conversations with others and listened to his arguments, and then they learned from him. So accusing him of being a teacher itself was false because he wasn't teaching anything. He was just having conversations with people and using logic in his conversations to prove that no one actually knows anything. So Socrates is known for saying, all I know is that I know nothing, because Socrates, he didn't memorize a whole bunch of information and try to teach it to others. That's what religion does. Socrates basically had conversations with other people and asked them, what do you know? And by probing them, in the end, he will realize that none of them actually knew anything. So when he said, how do you know about the gods? Who told you? Have you met one of the gods? No, you've never met the god and you heard it from people around town. You can't even remember who told you about the gods exactly, do you? No, but I know they're real. See? But you have my proof. So when Socrates was having these conversations, the young men of Athens were becoming enlightened because they started to ask questions themselves about everything. 800 years later, think about those ideas existed for 800 years. So when Socrates died, a young man named Plato wrote down all the conversations that he could remember that Socrates had. And this is essentially the beginning of Platonic philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche said, Christianity is Platonism for the masses, because Plato wrote down Socrates' conversations. This means that Plato's work is actually the first podcast. If you think about what a podcast is, you record with a camera conversations that people had. Plato recorded conversations that Socrates had on paper. And that's what the Socratic work is, basically just a collection of conversations. Plato tries to do it word for word. And so the first books of philosophy are actually the first podcasts. There were podcasts written on paper instead of being recorded with audio and video, but the aim is the same. So while we're looking at all these podcasts that we're seeing, they're actually modern day philosophies, modern day philosophers doing what the ancients were doing, except that they're capturing them on film. And this is why I've decided to go out to the world and have conversations with people, to record some of those conversations, bridging together the classical and the modern, bringing together classical philosophy and modern day podcasts and fusing them together. So when the Catholic Christians took over, right, they had to do battle with the universities that were established by Plato. Plato established the academy to keep alive Socrates' ideas. Aristotle, Plato's student, established the Lyceum. Aristotle created most of the disciplines that we know today, like biology, like game theory, because Aristotle, he wrote about logic. He created the first formal books of logic. Game theory is built on logic. You cannot have game theory without logic. So Aristotle is the first great game theorist. And with my book, I tie together mathematics, game theory, and philosophy. And so the Plato school, Aristotle school, they stood for about 800 years. The Catholics get into power and they have a problem. They have these schools of philosophy which undermine the power. So they close the schools of philosophy, kill most of the philosophers, burn the books, and the only book left is the Bible. So in order to overcome this and rewrite history, this is one of the greatest scams of all time. And I'm sorry if you are a Christian, because I grew up as a Christian. But after studying the philosophy and the books, I realized that the greatest sleight of hand has occurred. And no one really knows about it or talks about it. It took a philosopher to do that detective work and discover. You see, Jesus Christ, he was born 400 years after Socrates. 400 years. And so the Gospels that tell the story of Jesus Christ, they are actually plagiarized. It's plagiarism. Socrates and Jesus Christ are the same person. So in the Bible, it talks of an antichrist, and the antichrist will come, right? And he will be the opposite of Jesus, and he will establish 1,000-year reign, right? Well, the antichrist has already come, except that Christ was the anti-Socrates. See, he was the antichrist that was created to rewrite the story of Socrates. So if you think about the Gospels are basically a copycat of Plato's work, except that it's in Plato's work, the main character is Socrates. In the Bible, the main character has become Jesus Christ. And you know what? This idea is not attributed to me. It's attributed to Friedrich Nietzsche. Remember, Friedrich Nietzsche was the one who said that Christianity is an inversion of Roman culture. The Romans had no culture. The Romans took their culture from Greece. So the Romans copied everything that the Greeks did. So the Roman gods, they copied them from the Greek gods. They just changed their names. And this is what has happened throughout history. So the Romans taught about Socrates, right? So when the Christians came to power, in order to kill the story of Socrates, they replaced it with the story of Jesus Christ. It is possible that Jesus Christ was a teacher, a Jewish teacher, but Jesus Christ himself is not to blame because Jesus Christ was never a Christian. Jesus Christ was a Jewish Messiah, but when he died, it was Paul the Apostle who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, and in it, he took the story of Jesus Christ and used it to excel his own ideas. And it's happened because Paul was a Jew as well, right? And he persecuted Christians. He killed them. But when he realized he never met Jesus Christ, but he was alive at the same time, and he persecuted the disciples. And after trying to kill the Christian and stop Christianity spreading, he realized it was a lost game, that he couldn't do it because Christianity spread very quickly amongst the illiterate and the ignorant, around people without education. And Paul was very educated. He was a writer. And so he couldn't stop Christianity, so he switched his sides. Paul, the fake apostle, decides to join Christianity and says, actually, I am a Christian now. God appeared to me. Game theory, no? He defects. He acts like the bad guy. God appeared to me and he said to me that I will lead the church now. Paul was rejected by all the Jews. The Jews, Jesus' brother, Jesus, and the disciples, they tried to kill Paul. When Paul, after the death of Jesus Christ, he went to the disciples and tried to join them. And they tried to kill him because they said, we don't believe you. You've been killing Christians for decades. And now you're telling me that you become a Christian? Okay, you can become one of us. Well, we forgive you, but you need to die. So when the disciples grabbed Paul and tried to kill him, Paul yelled out to the Roman guards and said, Roman guards, I'm a Roman, save me. And so the Roman guards, they saved Paul because Paul was a Roman citizen. Even though he was a Jew, he had Roman citizenship. And that's the only reason that Paul was saved. Now, because of the Jews did not believe in Paul. They did not believe that Jesus appeared to him, and they didn't believe in his teachings. So what Paul did, because he was rejected by the Jews, he went to the Roman Empire from when he was born, and he started to appeal to the Gentiles, to the non-believers. He just reasoned, if the Jews won't follow me, let me create a new religion and teach it to the non-Jews. Maybe they will follow me. So Paul sets out, creates a new religion called Christianity. Paul created Christianity. Jesus was never a Christian. Jesus never created Christianity. Jesus has no idea that a whole religion was created in his name, right? But because the Roman Empire, right, for 800 years since Socrates, there have been schools of philosophy popping up throughout the empire, And in schools, this is where the intellectuals goes, the PhD. So they became the engineers, the mathematicians, the experts in language, and they built Rome as a society. It's like today, the people who build things, the roads, the technology, the legal system, they all go to universities, and this is where they learn. In the ancient world, they went to universities as well. The universities established by the philosophers, right? University means universal, right? That's what university means universal, because the philosophers taught every single discipline you can imagine. This is why you can be a philosopher in any discipline. You can be a PhD in any discipline. You can be a PhD in physics, PhD in mathematics, PhD in biology. PhD means philosophy doctor, doctor of philosophy, teacher of philosophy. So the philosophers, they educated all the people who built the Roman Empire, who built the roads, who built the technology, right? Paul creates this religion. And then this religion acquires the name Catholic, the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal. University means universal. So the Catholic Church, it pretends to be a university. It pretends to be everything that what the universities were. This is why they copied the name. Catholic means universal, university means universal. So the Catholic system creates a shadow system of the education system. So the reason that the universities were founded was to combat, to fight religion, the lies of religion, because the Greeks were using religion to rule the people. So the philosophers, when Socrates was sentenced to death, Plato created the university, the academy, from when we get the word academic. Academia is from Plato's university. If you're an academic, then you're a modern day student of Plato, the Lyceum. So in Greek philosophy, right, there is a there is a trinity. The trinity of Greek philosophy is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They are the founders of Greek philosophy, the founders of Western culture. That is the trinity. What Paul does, he creates a new trinity and creates a new shadow system. So the universities were created to fight the oppressive power of religion, right? And for 800 years, they were growing and they were leading the Enlightenment. People were becoming educated and society was progressing. Paul establishes the Catholic Church, which pretends to be the universal, the university, and he creates a new trinity. Says the trinity is not Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So in the story of Socrates, Socrates goes around having logical arguments with people. These arguments are called the Socratic method. And the Socratic method is basically a method of asking questions that can lead you to the truth. Because we take it for granted now that you can ask a question and find the truth. But in the ancient world, people didn't know that you could find truth. They didn't know that there was a thing called the truth. And they didn't know that we could find it if we asked the right questions. So when Socrates asked, well, who told you about the gods? And everyone said, oh, I don't really know. I got it from someone in town. He realized you don't have a proof. You don't have truth of the gods. Has anyone ever met the gods or seen them? Everyone said no. So he concluded, we cannot say that the gods are real because we have no proof. We cannot say that gods are true until we can prove their existence. So Paul creates a religion in which you don't need the truth. You just need faith. So faith is the opposite of truth, because when you believe something, belief and faith are essentially the same thing. You're accepting that you don't know. If you believe something, if you say, I believe this, you accept that you don't know this because you believe it. If you knew it, you wouldn't believe it. You would know it. Knowledge, gnosis, right? And so the philosophers with the Socratic method, they were able to acquire knowledge, right, instead of beliefs, right? What is knowledge? No, Plato said knowledge is justified true belief. For that, in my book, I created a new definition of knowledge because although this definition has been around for thousands of years, it's become problematic. And I think it's problematic because he uses the word belief, justified true belief. So if you believe something and you can justify it, then it becomes knowledge. But not long ago, there was a philosopher, but in the 60s, and he proved that actually you can believe something that's not true. Therefore, knowledge cannot be justified true belief. Was it Gettier, the Gettier problem? And his logic was simple. He said, imagine you look at a clock at 5 o'clock and it just happens to be 5 o'clock. So you have knowledge that it is 5 o'clock, but only by chance. You have a belief that it's 5 o'clock, therefore it's 5 o'clock. So you could say you have knowledge that it's 5 o'clock, right? Based on the clock. So your beliefs are correct. But then what happens if the clock is wrong and it's 1 hour behind? And you do the same thing, you believe that it's 5 o'clock, and the clock says it's 5 o'clock. So therefore, you've got false knowledge. You're in exactly the same position, but actually you have a good reason to justify your belief because you're basing it on the clock. But the clock is wrong, so your belief is wrong. So justified true belief cannot be knowledge. I think it was Gettier, the one who came up with that. So I propose a new definition of knowledge. And it's funny because I wrote this book such a long time ago. I don't even know if I remember what I wrote. But my definition was something along the lines of knowledge is the mind's understanding of the physical truth, something like that. So if something is true, right, and the mind has an accurate representation inside it, then that is what knowledge is, because knowledge has to be true. So the mind's and the mind's understanding of the facts, something along the lines. The mind's understanding of the facts, that is knowledge. So if the facts are correct in the real world, and the facts are also correct inside your mind, if the two align with each other, then that is knowledge because it is true inside your mind and it's true inside the real world. So Paul switches things around and he says, nonsense, nonsense. We don't need truth. We need faith. We need to believe. If you're a true believer, if God is going to help you, I have no truth and I have no proof. All you need is faith. That's the biggest test. If you can believe in something without the proof, then you are a good Christian and you will go to heaven in the afterlife instead of in this Roman world. Your reward will be in the afterlife by believing that faith is more powerful than truth. So, Paul establishes the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal, universal means university, right? Paul replaces the trilogy, the trinity of Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Paul, see, no one really knows who wrote the Gospels, but the Gospels were adopted, right, into the Bible. But the stories of the Gospels are the retelling of the stories of Socrates. Socrates goes to the world, has logical conversation, yeah, logical conversations, right? In Greek, logic means logos. So the word logos and logic in English, they sound the same. Logic is L-O-G-I-C, logos L-O-G-O-S. So the word logic and the word logos are exactly the same. But the Greeks say it logos, we say it logic. So Socrates uses logic to make arguments to teach people how to find the truth. The story of Jesus Christ is the opposite. Jesus Christ goes to the world and says to others, I am logic. You don't need to find the truth. I am the truth. Believe in me and you will find the truth and you will be saved. Socrates was learn logic, learn to think logically and you will save yourself. Jesus, I will save you because I am logic. So believe in me. You see, the Gospels were written in Greek. Most people don't know, but they weren't written in Aramaic or Hebrew. So Christianity is not a religion from the Middle East. Christianity is a European religion. It's a European religion written in a European language within the context of a European culture, because during the time of Christ, the Middle East was Europe. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, they ruled and they spoke European languages and they had European traditions. So Christianity is a European religion created by Paul in Europe because he was rejected by the Jews. So in Christianity, they changed everything about Socrates. Socrates teaches logos, logic. Jesus doesn't teach logic. He says, I am logic. You just need to believe in me, and that will save you when you're dead. Logic, Socrates, save yourself while you're alive, using your own logic. So there's a mistranslation of John 1:1 in the Bible, and the mistranslation is done to deceive people. In John 1:1 of the Bible, it says, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word is God. So Jesus is the Word in Christianity. He is God and he is the Word. But in Greek, logic and word are the same thing. So what the text says, if you read the Greek, find the Greek version for yourself. It says, what it should really say, it shouldn't have used the word word. It should have used the word logic. It should say, in the original Greek, it's written, in the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God. The Logos is God. The original text uses logos. If you translate that to English, it should say logic. So John 1:1, translated literally, should say, in the beginning there was logic. Logic was with God. Logic is God. Christians say that God, Jesus, is the logos. So they're saying that Jesus is logic. In other words, what I'm trying to say to you is that the worship of Jesus Christ as a God is the worship of logic as a God. And this was done basically because the Greek philosophers taught logic, and this teaching of logic undermined the power of the Catholic Church. So by teaching others, they embraced this and said, look, that logic you've been learning, we teach it as well. But you don't study the logic, you pray to it like a God. So the Catholics admit Jesus is logic, Jesus is God. So the worship of Jesus is the worship of logic. And you know what? This isn't such a bad thing if you think about it. Because the only thing that has happened is that the Greek philosophers believed logic was like a tool of the mind that allowed us to understand the natural world. And the Christians believe that that logic is actually the mind of God. It is God itself. And so perhaps logic is the mind of God. If you look at the universe looks like a supermassive brain. And we have brains inside our minds. So worshipping the logic which underpins our reality is what the Catholics do, the Christians. The Greeks, what they did is studied it. They studied it, they didn't worship it. Yet this idea, again, is traced back to the Greeks, because the Greeks, they called the universe the macrocosm. Macro means supermassive. And they said that human beings are microcosms, means micro means small. So the Greeks believed that the universe was a brain, and they believed that we were small versions of that brain. You know, the Russian doll, a Russian doll, right? And a fractal is a pattern that repeats in nature. So imagine a massive Russian doll. That's one mathematical pattern. And then inside it, you have another Russian doll. That's also a mathematical pattern, but it's not exactly the same. And for that reason, it is a fractal. So a fractal, we see it in geometry, but a, a fractal is really just a mathematical pattern that looks like a bigger mathematical pattern repeating itself as at smaller intervals. So if you think of the sphere, the atom's like a sphere, cells are like spheres, A human baby starts like a sphere inside an egg that's like a sphere. The planet's like a sphere. The solar system's like a sphere. The galaxy's like a sphere. The universe is like a sphere. So they are geometric mathematical patterns repeating themselves. And at each level, they're slightly different, but they resemble all the other levels. That's what a fractal is. So my theory of reality is the reality is a Russian doll, fractal-like, that we exist in a Russian doll, fractal-like nested reality. Nested is when you put something inside a nest. So there's something inside something, something inside something, something's inside that, and it goes on endlessly. So reality is a set of brains, and inside each brain there's a smaller brain. Inside that brain, a smaller brain, and a smaller brain, and a smaller brain, because a brain is just a network of elements that cooperate with each other. By interacting, they cooperate. And so Jesus was created in history to erase the story of Socrates, because today we speak about Jesus, but nobody speaks about Socrates unless you're a philosopher. And so in Greek, logos and word, they're the same thing. So because the, the Greeks understood that in order for me to communicate logic to you, I have to use words. We can only communicate logic with words. In the classical world, mathematics was written down with words, regular languages. So if you said 1 + 1 = 2, you would have to write ONEPLUSEQUEUELS So that's how mathematics in the ancient world was written, with normal language. So to the Greeks, words are logic. You can only communicate logic to someone else using words. So in Greek, logic and word are the same thing, because logic was done with words, and words were created for the purpose of logic. So me communicating to you using words here is because I want to articulate and communicate some kind of logical idea to you. So in the modern world, we have separated words and logic, but in the classical world, words and logic were the same thing. And this occurred with the creation of mathematical symbols. Mathematical symbols have only been around a couple of 100 years, believe it or not. A few 100 years. It could have been 400, 500 years when mathematicians started to use symbols instead of words, because it was easier and quicker. So instead of using one, ONE, the symbol for one was created. Instead of writing two, TWO, the symbol for two was created. So the symbols were created in modern times to make logic and mathematics simpler. So in the modern days, people have begun to think that mathematics and language are different and separate, but they're not. They're exactly the same thing. And this is why Socrates, his work was based on logos, logic, teaching logic. The rest of the Christians became worshipping logic as a god. So the Catholics closed all the universities. The philosophers fled, and the second dark age began. Because people didn't have an education, society, no one knew how to rebuild the towns again. No one knew how to make the technology. No one knew how to restore the aqueducts, because the universities were closed. And so the world plunged into the second dark age. But this was done on purpose, because the emperors were Catholics, and they used religion to consolidate power. They just wanted absolute power. They didn't care about the universities. They saw them as a threat to their power. So by purposefully turning the lights off, because education is enlightenment, it's a light inside your brain, right? If you close them, then your brain goes into darkness and no one can build anything. And so in the Bible, it says that the Antichrist would come and he would have 1,000-year reign. Well, Jesus came, the Catholics established Christianity as the official religion, and for 1,000 years, the second dark age, the dark ages that we learn in school, began. And so, in essence, it's a prophecy fulfilled, except that most Christians are waiting for it to happen in the future, but it has already happened in the past. and it's going to happen again. So Jesus became the God of Europe. For 1,000 years, the belief in Christianity wasn't challenged because Jesus is the anti-Socrates. The Antichrist is not some future, it is the past. Jesus is the anti-Socrates, the opposite of Socrates. And he had a 1,000-year reign with the Dark Ages when the Roman Empire collapsed about 500 AD. And then for 1,000 years, there was a dark age, and the most powerful people established feudal systems in which kings ruled religiously. The King of England became the head of the of the Church of England. So governments and religions have always been government. Religions are just ancient governments, right? Now, when the Muslims took over Southern Europe and Spain, they brought back philosophy, the Greek philosophy that had been lost. And so 1,000 years after the collapse of Rome, because Rome didn't really collapse, it just became a feudal system without education, right? And then intellectuals began to discover in Spain, in Muslim Spain, all the old books of philosophy that had been burnt and erased by the Christian Catholics, since many philosophers escaped to the land of the Muslims. And this is why the Muslims rose and became the most powerful force in the world, because the Greeks came back with knowledge that they had been lost to them. Since the Sumerians and the Egyptians, a lot of that knowledge collapsed when the civilizations collapsed, but it was kept alive in Greece and then Rome. So then when the philosophers fled to the east, they brought with them Greek philosophy. And so the Enlightenment begins again. So when we learn in school about the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, they call it the Renaissance, the rebirth, because it became the rebirth of Roman Europe, of Greco-Roman Europe was born again, around 1500s, 1500 AD, when the European intellectuals began to discover Greek philosophy in Muslim Spain. This started the rebirth, the Renaissance, and then the Age of Enlightenment. And then the Enlightenment was born again. From that, re-established universities, the schools opened up, people learned how to build roads again, how to build cities again, how to build aqueducts again. And that brings us down to the modern day. Now, as a student of philosophy and a student of history, I have come to realize that the second age of enlightenment, right, is about to come to an end. So the first dark age was from the birth of our species, and it ended when the Sumerians and the Egyptians established the first civilizations, and that led to the first enlightenment, which spread to Greece and Rome. The first enlightenment was brought to an end by the Catholics, who established Christianity and plagiarized Plato's work, and they swapped the story of Plato with the story of Jesus Christ. In doing so, they closed the universities and began the Second Dark Age. The Second Dark Age ended in Europe with the Renaissance, when the Europeans rediscovered Greek philosophy. The Dark Age of Enlightenment has been going on for 500 years, and it's still alive and well right now. It has led to globalization, to the Industrial Revolution. But here's the problem. Artificial intelligence has now arrived, right? And because of that, soon they will begin to close universities and schools as well. Because imagine you're a doctor and you get replaced by an AI. Who's going to go to university for that? If you're an architect and the architect can just design the building, who's going to study architecture? If you're a mathematician and all you need is ChatGPT, why are you going to study maths? If you're an engineer and robots can now build houses and cars, in China, some factories for cars are fully automated. Why would you go and study for university? And so what is happening now, they're saying 90% of the jobs will be lost in the next couple of decades. So if 90% of the jobs are lost, 90% of people will stop going to school. Why would they keep universities open when they will acquire an education that they don't need since there aren't any jobs. So what's going to happen is that the AI is going to replace us in the workforce. As you can see, the rich and powerful have been increasing inflation, and they're buying up all the land and all the houses. And so we're slowly heading towards the third dark age. During the third dark age, AI will replace people in the workplace. Robots and automation will make the vast majority of people unemployed. Without money to buy things, the rich will finish buying the rest of the land and all the houses. We're seeing it in the UK. BlackRock has come, asset management companies, and they're buying up all the land and they're buying up all the houses. So what happens to us? Do we really think the rich are going to spend their resources keeping people who don't have jobs alive? Are they going to give us houses for nothing? Are they going to give us money for nothing? No. So I believe that we're going to be driven to extinction. And I say this because in the history books, every time an animal, an organism, a group of people are not needed, they are driven to extinction. When we left Africa, 60,000 years ago, they said 60,000 years ago, there was only 1,000 human beings, roughly. About 50 of those human beings left Africa and they established all the human populations around the world. The thing is, when they got to all of these lands, there were already people there. There were the Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans. But what did human beings do to these people? Well, we killed them all. Most of them we just killed. Some of them we interbred with them. So some of us carry their DNA, but we just killed them all. What happened to the animals that were there? Like the woolly mammoths, the saber-toothed tigers, we killed them all. They're saying that right now is the biggest extinction moment because human beings, we're driving thousands and thousands of species to extinction because we don't need them. Look, in Europe, there used to be wolves and bears running wild a few hundred years ago. We killed them all. And we've replaced them only with the animals that we find useful, the animals that we find useful for food. So pigs, cows, and chickens. If we all became vegetarian tomorrow, like vegans want, the vegans have never thought, what would happen to all the cows and chickens? Well, we would just let them die or kill them all. Before the car came to dominate the roads, 100 years ago, there were 10 times more horses. But because we don't need them anymore, then we just let them die or stop reproducing them and kill them all. If we look at what's happening in the Middle East, in Africa, what happened when the Europeans reached these places? The American Indians, we killed them all. All the people were killed from all these primitive tribes. In terms of black people, the only reason black people were kept alive was because they needed us for our labor. So in the new dark age, when AI and robots take over, and there's millions of people who are not needed as slaves, people not needed as workers, they're just going to kill us all because they're going to want all the land so they can build vast estates. Not only that, with global warming and all these global problems, you can solve all our global problems by reducing the human population by 90%. And so we're returning to a dark age in which some people have loads of money, power, land, artificial intelligence, and robots. And they will destroy the people who are not needed. And with this, the second enlightenment will come to an end and the third age of darkness would arise. Luckily for us, we have the philosophy of the future. See, Nietzsche anticipated that there would be a philosophy of the future. According to game theory, what we need to do is we need to go from the second enlightenment and bring about the third enlightenment, the third age of enlightenment. We need to go to the next level. During the second enlightenment, individuals became enlightened. They were allowed to study, allowed to become PhDs, allowed to educate themselves, and they rose throughout society and build the world that we see now. So in order for us to get to the third enlightenment. We need to establish a direct democracy. A direct democracy. The democracy that we see in the world at the moment is false. It's not a true democracy. They've lied to us. Because the super rich, they get to choose the politicians. And once the politicians are in power, the politicians do what the rich ask them to do. The politicians, they exist like a protective shield. So that if a politician gets something wrong, the career of the politician ends, but the rich people behind the politician, yeah, they're left untouched since no one knows who they are. They call it the deep state. In ancient Rome, this same battle had been playing out. So you had the philosophers on one side, and then you have the sophists on the other. A sophist is basically someone who just lies because they want power and manipulates others. So the power of the sophist is the lie. The power of the philosopher is the truth. Yet these two sets of people have been represented throughout history, and they can be found in every movie, in every story. Because a sophist is really, you see, and in the animal kingdom, there are two types of animals. There are predators and there are prey, right? The people who have all the power, the military power, the power of violence, like the government and all the money, they are the predators. And their power is us, the prey. We are the prey. They exploit us. We work, they make all the money. That's how it works, right? And it has always been this way. The predators have always been in charge, and they are the sophists. A sophist means, Sophia means wisdom in Greek. So a sophist is a wise man, a man who has the wisdom. But a philosopher is the opposite. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom, lover of Sophie, philosophy, lover of Sophia, lover of wisdom. Right. So the enemy of the sophists are the philosophers. The enemy of the philosophers are the sophists. The philosophers represent the prey animals. That's us. Because we have no military power. The only thing we have is the truth. Because when you can show the truth to others, prey animals unite and work together. We cooperate. So the only power that prey animals have is safety in numbers. We see in the animal kingdom. And in order to inspire others for safety in numbers, you have to find the truth. But the predators, the sophists, they say, we are the truth. The truth is might makes right. This is a Greek idea. Whoever has the power decides what happens, decides what's right and wrong. And so the universities were established by the philosophers in order to unite the people of the world with the truth so that they could fight the predators called the sophists. Now, I created a concept, right? We tend to think of religious books. Well, all the literature of dead people, I call it the book of the dead. And all the literature of living authors, I call it the book of the living. You see, all books contain mathematical information. Game theory. Game theory describes decision making, problem solving. And so with game theory, we're able to solve problems. If you look at all the literature, even the spiritual books and even all the made up stories, they teach us about life. And we can learn from these stories to make our lives better. This is why the spiritual books were written, so that people could use the game theory inside those books to build a better life. But you can do that from all books. They don't need to be spiritual. If you take Shakespeare, the reason that Shakespeare is probably the greatest writer in our history is because his stories told us about the way that people behave. And we could learn from his stories so that we could build a better life for ourselves. That's why Shakespeare was legendary. So these are the books of the dead. But the books of the living, they also contain the same information. If you think about the movies like Star Wars, it's basically the same story. In Star Wars, the Jedi are the philosophers and the Sith, they are the sophists. If you look at every nation has a Sith Lord and his apprentice. Every president is the Sith Lord, yeah, and every prime minister is a Sith Lord. and their apprentice is the deputy prime minister or the vice president. So if the Sith Lord dies, then the second in command takes over. So every nation has a Darth Vader and every nation has a Sith, and they rule all nations because they are the predatory class. They are the sophists. And all nations have intellectuals, don't they? Modern day intellectuals are the philosophers. So the politicians, they are the modern day Siths, right? They are modern day sophists. And the philosophers, they are the modern day intellectuals. They are the modern day Jedis. If you look at Star Wars, this is the Book of the Living. It's the same story. Neo and the Resistance, they represent the philosophers, and the Matrix represents the Sith Lords, the predatory masterclass. In fact, the Matrix is based on the story of Socrates, because the story of Socrates begins with the oracle. An oracle is a woman. And a friend of Socrates who needs help goes to the oracle and says, "Who's the wisest man in Athens? I need help. I need to seek him out." And she says, "Socrates is the wisest man in all of Athens." And so he seeks out Socrates for his help. And he says to Socrates, "The oracle says you're the wisest man in the world." And the oracle said that he was the wisest because he's the only one who knew he knew nothing. "All I know is that I know nothing." And then Socrates says, "I don't believe this. I'm not the wisest. Let me speak to the wisest people on the land and prove to you that I'm not the wisest." This is the story of Socrates. So he has conversations with people to prove that he's not the wisest and that he can't help. It's the story of Neo. Neo is like, "I'm not the one." Socrates is like, "Oh, I'm not the one." The idea of the one is an idea in Greek philosophy. The one is basically the universe. Basically, if you think of physics and you have this idea of the singularity, I explain this in my book. The singularity in physics is actually just the story of the one in Greek philosophy. But then the Christians adopted the story of the one. I call it the story of God, and the God is the one, the everything. This is what Nietzsche said, that Christianity is Platonic philosophy for the masses, because Nietzsche realized that all Christianity is just plagiarized Greek philosophy, plagiarized the work of Plato, plagiarized the work of Socrates, and called it Jesus and called it Christianity, but with the caveat that because the master class, the predatory master class, because we're just predators and prey animals in the real world. Yeah, because they needed the power, they copied Greek philosophy and lied and twisted it and then used it to rule the world with it. And we're seeing it today. The same thing is happening. The internet's been censored. The predatory masterclass, they have access to our phones and all of our private data now. They own all the AI, and soon they will close the universities when the jobs run out, so a second age of darkness will come. Plato and Socrates, they hated the idea of democracy because a democracy sentenced Socrates to death. And they tried to do the same with Aristotle, but Aristotle escaped. See, the problem with democracy that they saw was that not everyone had democracy. In Greece, only the leading wealthy men had power to democracy. But because there were such few of them, any king or warlord could just threaten all of them and force them to vote whatever way they wanted. So even though in Socrates' court case, he argues why he's innocent, and everyone knows he's innocent, the democracy is forced to vote him guilty anyway, so that they could get rid of him and they could allow religion to rule. And that's exactly what happens. So Plato and Socrates hated democracy. However, we live in the modern world now. We live in the world of the internet. And so the opportunity has emerged for us to create a direct democracy. This is a democracy in which every citizen gets to vote on everything. And because there's so many of us, prey animals, they cannot corrupt 60 million people, 60, 70 million people in the UK, 8 billion people in the world. You cannot corrupt them all at the same time. How would this work? Well, we all have apps, don't we? In the UK, we have the HMRC app. With this app, it has all of our tax data, all of our personal data. All they need to do is add a button to this app. We don't need a revolution, we need an evolution. So every time that the government proposes legislation, all citizens, it has to be approved by citizens. So we've got the House of Lords, which is the house of the noble who rule us, the kings and the lords. And then we have the House of Commons, which is the house of the rich people. We need to create the people's house, a house for all citizens, and that needs to be the main house. So if the government wants to take our jobs, the people should have the right to object to these new laws. We also now have a system of petitions. We could create a law that says that once a petition reaches 1 million, it has to be debated by government. And whatever the outcome is, all citizens get to vote in real time, whether they approve the petition or not. In other words, what I'm saying to you is we need to bring about the end of the political system as it is, because it is not a true democracy. They call it a representative democracy because the MPs represent us, but they work for the rich, not for us. We need to represent ourselves. In a direct democracy, parties no longer matter because if everyone gets to vote on everything, there are no more parties. But every citizen gets the opportunity to create a petition. And if they have enough signatures of 1 million, their petitions have to be heard out and voted by the citizens. If we were to achieve this, we would create a collective consciousness. Society would be turned into a highly functional super brain in which every single one of us behaves like a brain cell in society. Every single one of us can propose ideas that have the possibility of rising to the top, and we can all vote on whether we approve these ideas or not. This would create a collective consciousness and a direct democracy. So I'm working on the direct democracy of their collective consciousness. You see, when they start taking away the jobs and we're not needed in the workforce, we've lost all our power. They can send robots to incarcerate us, or they can send a new pandemic to get rid of all the people that they don't need. And if human history is consistent, they will get rid of us the way they got rid of the Neanderthals, the way they got rid of the American Indians, the way they getting rid of people in the Middle East and around Africa and Latin America. They're getting rid of all these people that they don't need. So we have to make ourselves needed. To become needed, we have to create a direct democracy, because then no legislation can pass unless it's agreed by everyone. And so that is my mission in life. To use the philosophy of the future, game theory, to get all human beings cooperating together, functioning as a collective consciousness inside a direct democracy. And this would give rise to the third age of enlightenment. In the second age of enlightenment, we had the Renaissance. People rediscovered Greek philosophy and the world flourished. In the third age of enlightenment, we would stop acting like an individual and we start acting like a hive mind. This hive mind makes Nietzsche's Übermensch redundant. We don't need Napoleonic heroes. We don't need Hitlers. We don't need a US president that rules the world with an iron fist. We need the power of the people. We need a world in which people rule each other using game theory, which is the new philosophy. Such a world would be a world of ideas. It would function. We already have the technology. Think of it like social media, right? If you start a petition and it goes viral and acquires 1 million likes, the government has to debate your idea as an individual. And whatever the outcome is, everyone in the nation gets to vote whether your petition gets approved or rejected. And we need this in place and we need it before we lose our jobs. Once we lose our jobs, it's too late. We have bargaining power now. The predators keep us alive because we are the workforce. But if they can replace us with robots and AI, they will not keep us alive. Guaranteed. Do you really think they are going to use those resources to feed people without jobs? They don't do it now. Look in the US, people don't have um, uh, medical insurance. Now, when all those people lose their jobs, you really think they're going to get medical insurance then? If you don't have it now, you're not going to have it tomorrow once the jobs are right now. So we're facing an existential crisis. And this existential crisis could start playing itself out in the next decade, in the next 20 years. I've seen figures in which companies have stopped hiring. I've seen a lot of these tech companies are laying people off because AI is replacing them in the workforce. This isn't a problem of somewhere in the distant future. It is a problem now. And the thing is, the AI doesn't have to be that sophisticated. No, it doesn't. As long as the AI doesn't have to acquire human consciousness to become a threat to 90% of us, the prey animals, the philosophers, those who follow the truth. It has to just be effective enough so that those who own the AI don't need us. So look at driving jobs. We can all see that they're actively trying to create self-driving cars, and they have. They've been approved in some places. A driving job is the most popular job in the world. Did you know that? Driving goods and people from place to place, that is the most done job. Once that job disappears because things can drive themselves, you're looking at 20-30% of people in the workplace disappearing overnight. You know, throughout history, there's always been spiritual men. We had the Buddha, we had Jesus Christ, we had Confucius, we had Mohammed, and these spiritual men were later replaced by philosophers because philosophy came from religion. A philosophy is really just an updated version of religion, which uses logic, uses Socrates' logos, the logos, right? The logos is to be studied and used as a tool. The logos, the logic of the universe, it isn't for us to worship as a god. We can do, but it's more useful when we use it as a tool and study it, right? And there has been philosophers throughout time. We've had Nietzsche. Nietzsche believed in the Übermensch. We had Wittgenstein, and he told us about the power of words. How if you change a word, you change reality. And this is what's happened. By changing the word Socrates to the word Jesus, we change reality. By changing the word logos, logic, to the word in English, we change reality. By talking of an antichrist that was to come, we use language to hide the fact that the antichrist had already arrived. So the Christians kept telling you the antichrist is coming and that they had the savior, when in fact their savior was the antichrist, except that he was the anti-Socrates. And they used that to create an age of ignorance, the second dark age. And now, when the AI takes over and the universities begin to close, because history repeats itself, they've already closed the universities. The Catholics did it, but now the feudal system that is arriving will close them again. You see, what we have in our world is not capitalism anymore, it's feudalism. It is feudalism because companies like BlackRock, Blackstone, Vanguard, they're owned by the same people, but these companies, they own all the companies in the world. And because they own all the companies and most of the land, soon they will have the rest of it, which means the capitalism has already ended and feudalism has taken its place. You can tell the difference between capitalism and feudalism. In capitalism, right, you create ownership. In capitalism, you sell houses so people buy houses. You sell land so people have land. You sell cars so people have cars. You sell music so people have music. And so capitalism creates ownership, right? After the Second World War, there was ownership throughout Europe and people became wealthier. In feudalism, you don't sell anything, you own everything, and people have to pay a form of rent. Now, people can't afford to buy houses, so they're renting houses. They can't afford to buy a car, so they take out these car loans, and then by the time they pay the car breaks down and they have to buy another car loan to have a car. You can't buy music, you have to lease it. You can't buy films, you have to lease it. But they use clever language like, these are all form of rent, this is all form of feudalism. So feudalism is the cornerstone of the Dark Age. When the second Dark Age came to be, the Catholics, Christians, they took all the land, and the Catholic kings, they took all the land for themselves, and people couldn't buy houses, they couldn't have land. We used to be able to buy these things, we can't buy them anymore. And so we need to restore capitalism. Capitalism's gone, it's done. And when I say we need to restore capitalism, we need to go back to a time when people could buy their own land, buy their own house, buy their own cars, buy their own music, buy their own films. We need to create a society in which people own things. So if you look at China, China realized this and they created a new system. They call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So the government nationalized the land, so the government owns all the land. They did it because they knew that one day rich foreigners would buy up all the Chinese land and the people wouldn't have land, you see? And this is why Chinese capitalism is defeating Western capitalism, because in Chinese capitalism, everyone has land simply because they are communists and they have a collective ownership of all the land. Nobody can come from outside and buy it, and everyone has the right to have a house and throughout their lifetime. So they create ownership for the people. Meanwhile, in the West, the feudal lords are taking it all for themselves. Anyway, I probably have gone too far and too deep into this video. In this book, I have my philosophy, but in the book that I'm about to finish, my biography, it explains how I got to this, how I created the new philosophy, how I discovered it. And in the third book that I'm working on, I detail how we go about building a direct democracy and a collective consciousness. So perhaps Friedrich Nietzsche was right. There would be a philosophy of the future, and there would be a philosopher of the future who would come down from the mountains like Zarathustra and return again so that we can save our world. Thus, the video series that I'm creating, I call it the ultimate game, the game of life, UGGL, because we are playing the ultimate game. We're playing the game of life. And so by approaching this game as a real game using mathematical strategies, the aim of the game is to prevent the third dark age from taking over. And instead, we must establish the third age of enlightenment, an age in which the enlightened individuals become a collective consciousness. And this collective consciousness rules the world as a direct democracy in a world of ideas, and a world which allows the best ideas to rise to the top. A world that is no longer about Ubermensch like individuals like Napoleon Bonaparte, no more Hitlers, no more Caesars, no more Alexanders, no more prime ministers and presidents that rule us with an iron fist. We must allow the logic, the logos, to rule us. We should be ruled by logos. As Heraclitus said, he said, trust not in me, but in the logos, that all things are one. See? All things are one. Trust not in me, but in the logic, that all things are one. We are one. And so we must work as one. If we are to survive this, because if not, all will be lost. And those who lose their jobs will be driven to extinction. For that is the way of the human being. That's what we do. But yet, the light at the end of the tunnel is the human beings, we have the capacity to ignore our nature or to overcome it, to come up with a different solution. For example, human beings, weren't given wings so we could fly. But in the end, enlightenment drove us to build airplanes, and here we are, taking trips to the heavens whenever we like. And this is what we must do with the political system. You have to create a system that works for us and not the other way around. Now, for the ultimate game, the rich, the predatory masterclass, they're not coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. And this is why I invite you to play along with me in the ultimate game, the game of life, UGGL. In this game, I've spent my time like Zarathustra, studying philosophy, studying history, just for the fun of it, trying to overcome my problems in life, not realizing that one day this knowledge could become valuable to the world. I hate to sound arrogant, but I do believe that if you don't believe in your own greatness, it will never manifest to existence. Imagine a pilot who does not believe he can fly a plane. He might not be able to fly the plane. He might have an accident of confidence due to a lack of confidence. But someone who says, I have the experience, I have the knowledge, I have flown thousands of missions, you would trust that person because of his confidence. So, during my journeys, I've developed 5 main powers. Music, I can mix, master, write songs, compose. Writing, I've been writing books of philosophy. Visuals, I've been learning to create videos, edit. The power of philosophy, I've discovered the philosophy of the future. Talking to people while working in customer service on the railways, I've developed the ability to talk to people, even though it's very difficult because I'm an anxious and shy person, but here I am. And I want to use those 5 powers to acquire another couple of powers. The power of social media, being able to get your story and your message out there. And I guess the power of money, so that when the time comes, I can work towards establishing a direct democracy of the collective consciousness, so that we may save ourselves from the coming dark age, and instead we can establish an age of enlightenment, the third age of enlightenment. So I will go out to the world like Zarathustra in the books, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, like Jesus in his books, like Socrates in his books, like the Buddha, talking to people, trying to use these powers, trying to get to the next level, approaching life like a game of strategy. I mean, I did write the book on game theory, hoping that somehow we can avert the coming catastrophe. And the thing is this, I know it may sound like this is just never going to happen and I'm a fantasist. But if this were true, the history books will be different. Rome did collapse. The universities were closed. The philosophers were murdered and driven away. The books of philosophy were erased. Humanity did live in a dark age for 1,000 years. The Antichrist ruled us. The Antichrist being the religions which enslaved us. That is the true Antichrist, because they are the opposite of Socrates and the philosophers who wanted to open our minds and help us fulfill our true potential as human beings by teaching us how to use the logic, the logos, which underpins our reality. So if it happened before, what makes you think it's not going to happen again? You see, when I was a kid, I used to have these dreams. Every day, I'm talking about being 4 or 5 years old, there was a pyramid and I would climb up this pyramid. I came through the jungle, and then it was a recurring dream that I used to have almost every day for years. And then coming through the jungle, I couldn't really see what was there, but I knew there was somewhere that I needed to get to. In the end, finally, I got through the jungle, and in the jungle, there was a pyramid. I didn't know what pyramids were at that time. I didn't have a television as a kid. I'm from South America, lived in a shanty town. I didn't have a television, lived in poverty. You know, I ended up in the UK as a refugee because my father started a political party helping people who were having their land stolen. And even though he won and helped them get the rights to defend themselves, he was kidnapped and he had to leave and come to the UK so that he could survive. And then he brought us over. And that's my story. My story is kind of like my father's story, really, fighting to help people keep their land. I want to fight to help people keep their lands because our nation's been stolen away. And it is by migrants, but not the poor migrants coming here to work. It's by the wealthy oligarchic migrants like BlackRock who are buying everything from under our feet because they own the banks. By owning the banks, they print free money and lend it to themselves so they can buy everything else. And this is why we have inflation. We have inflation because they print fictional money from banks and then lend it to themselves so they can buy everything. In China, the government created state-owned banks. So therefore, in China, the biggest banks are owned by the government. In fact, the 5 biggest banks in the world are owned by the Chinese government. And this is how the Chinese government has stopped the rich from owning all the land. They also nationalized the land. So perhaps we need to also create national banks that would allow us citizens to buy back our land and prevent the rich foreigners from taking it all for themselves. Anyway, in my dream, I would eventually reach the pyramid and then I would see how tall the pyramid was and I would try to climb. And it would take me, I had this dream for years and for years and years, I couldn't get to the top of the pyramid, but sometimes I'll get closer and closer and closer and closer. I used to get frustrated sometimes and I used to try to jump all the way up. But every time I would jump, I would fall. And the fall would be so horrific that I would wake up in a panic until I realized that I can't jump. I have to go step by step. And I believe that it was like something telling me what the future would be because I have tried to succeed in life in many different things, like when I used to play football, when I used to make music. And each time I fell on my face and I couldn't succeed that way, just like in the dream. The dream said I had to go step by step. I guess it wanted me to learn every single step that was needed to get all the way to the top. Anyway, as the years rolled by, one day I got to the top of the pyramid and there were 3 other beings there. And then we all sat at each corner. It was flat at the top like a square. And I wondered, who's these 3 beings? I don't know where they're from. Turns out I've got a brother and 2 sisters. Perhaps they must have been the 3 beings from my dream because together we have grown up together. Anyway, once I sat down on my seat that was waiting for me in the top of the pyramid, I began to hear people's voices, the voice of the world. I could see people's minds, and in their minds, I could see all the suffering, and the suffering was deafening. It was just millions and millions of people calling for help, calling for help. And then I felt that I had to help them, and then I couldn't just stand by right at the top. I had to come and help these people. And then the dream progressed. I started coming down the pyramid, trying to get there fast enough to help. And sometimes I would jump so I could get there quicker. But every time I took a jump, I would hit the ground hard and I would wake up. And I always wanted to know what was at the end of the pyramid until one day I finally got to the end of the pyramid. And the jungle was there again. And I felt that I'm going to go out and help these people who are calling for help. And I left the jungle. I never had the dream again. Never had the dream again. So in a way, I feel like I was always supposed to come and help. Yeah, when I got to my 30s, I became depressed because I failed at everything in life. That's the truth. Everything I tried to do, music, football, you know, education, with the law. I was supposed to become a lawyer like my father, but failed. And I got this job at this train station. And I remember the dream I had. And I got so depressed. Was supposed to marry this girl and she left. Met someone at work, cancelled the wedding anyway. She went, left me heartbroken. And I was in this train station and I decided to take my life actually. I was working on the platform and I was just gonna jump in front of a train. And then with tears rolling down my eye, I couldn't really see where the train was. So as I tried, I stopped. And I thought, let me get some courage. Let me try this again. And as I looked for courage to do it, and I wiped the tears on my face, and I looked up. I suddenly saw the pyramid of my dreams. I worked at this train station for like more than 15 years, and I hated the job to begin with. But then once I finally saw the pyramid, I realized, wait, this is the pyramid of my dreams. You see, the station's at the top of a hill. And then within that station, there are three staircases. And the staircases go up like in a shape of a pyramid. And because I work there every day, I have to run up and down the stairs, up and down the stairs. And while working there, I always talk to people because I get so bored and depressed. And then I start to find out their stories. Right. Remember in the dream, it said I could hear the pain of the people of the world. Well, living in London, this is an international city. So you get people from every corner of the earth. I've met people from Africa, Latin America, China, India, all over Europe, America, from Russia, from everywhere, the Middle East. And then you get to know people and you hear their stories, you hear their pain, and you see their suffering. And my job is to help them every day, like with their journeys, with luggage, helping disabled people coming in and out of the trains. And I realized this was the dream. This was the dream that I had all those years ago. Because, you know, if you don't have a creative mind, you will just see a train station, right? But using creativity, I realized the staircases in this train station, they structured like a pyramid, as if there was a pyramid hidden behind it. But when we think about it, what is a pyramid? A pyramid is just a mountain, a man-made mountain, isn't it? We use steps because it's easy to climb, and pyramids are normally in the shape of like a triangle, squared pyramids. And the whole train station is like one side of a pyramid with the steps running up and down. And then that's when I decided, actually, perhaps I shouldn't take my life. Perhaps there was a reason why I had that dream. Perhaps I had that dream all those years ago because in an alternative reality, maybe I jump and I don't live. But maybe some of that information has somehow been passed to myself in the past. And so by remembering the dream, I stopped myself from jumping. Maybe I had jumped and regretted it, or maybe I died, and somehow some of that information passed to myself in all those dreams. And those dreams is what stopped me from making that leap. So while working at this train station, all I've been doing is trying to better myself, acquiring my five powers of music, writing, visuals, video, philosophy, and talking to people. But now I feel that I'm finally ready to leave that pyramid and start talking to people and finally start helping them out like I was supposed to in the dreams. You know, some say that I'm insane. They say I'm crazy. Anyone I tell this story, they say you're absolutely insane. There's no way that what you're saying is true. But then when we look through history, we can't ignore that there was a Buddha, there was a Sun Tzu, there was a Muhammad, there was a Jesus Christ, there was a Socrates, there was a Plato, there was an Aristotle, there was an Immanuel Kant, there was a Nietzsche, there was a Wittgenstein. So why can there not be a Levinossi, Michael Lorenzo Levinossi? Why can't my book help? When so many other books and works have been written and they have helped. In the end, just examine the ideas for yourself and make up your mind. But I will now go out to the world like a video game character because the game theory is the cornerstone of my philosophy. And if you think about the world of AI, artificial intelligence, it is driven by game theory, by the logic of the mathematics which underpins our reality. So my philosophy is perfectly suitable for this time. So like when I used to play video games, I gave them up as a kid because I loved them so much. But at the age when I became like 16, 17, I realized that if I just continued playing video games, I wouldn't do nothing else with my life. So I stopped. But now I remember the lessons that I learned from the video games. like Mario, like Link in Zelda, like Samus in Super Metroid, which were my favorite games. The character goes out to the world and explores, and he talks to people. And by meeting different characters, he begins to understand what the game is about, but also he begins to identify the problems. And by identifying the problems throughout the game, he acquires powers. And these powers ultimately allow him to save the world, because every game is ultimately about saving the world. And this is why I've created the ultimate game, the game of life, with a bid to doing what I can to help the people of the world save themselves. So join me and play along. We have to do this together. I cannot do it alone. Believe it or not, the fate of the world depends on this. The AI has arrived. I used to also have this dream. I had this dream, right? And basically, I saw the richest, most powerful people in the world, and they had all come together, and they created a plan. And in this plan, they already had control of the world, but they decided to create a dark age. And so this is the problem that they had, right? And I saw into the minds of the richest, most powerful people in the world. These people had all the money and all the political power, but yet they felt powerless. Why? I saw into their hearts and soul, and it wasn't enough. Why did they feel powerless? Well, because they read the books. They knew the history. They read of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, Adolf Hitler, Genghis Khan, and they envied these men. The way that the current men, they felt that their power was nothing to the power that the great conquerors of the world had. They wanted to be Nietzschean Ubermensch. And what was standing in the way was this modern society which crippled their power. You see, when you have power, the only thing you want is more power. And once you have that power, more power. It's a vicious circle. There is no end to the power that they want. So the solution that they had was that they would start a conflict. And in that conflict, they will acquire even greater power. And then they started to kill people. A war broke out in the world, except that this war wasn't nations against nations. It was the super rich and powerful, and they were taking everything from everyone else because they could, because they wanted greater power, like the power that they had read about in the history books. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, we're seeing it play out how people still want that violent power. They don't need to solve things with violence, but that desire is still there. And it's never going to go away, because the powerful men of today feel powerless because they cannot kill whoever stands in their way. And that's really what true power has always been about, being able to destroy and kill those you don't like so that you could build the world however you want it. Remember Nero, when he burnt the city of Rome so that he could clear the people out and build Rome how he wanted. So in the dream, I was trying to fight with these men. And I was trying to stop them, and I wasn't able to. And I was pinned to the ground, and someone grabbed the knife and they pinned it to my chest, and it went right through my heart. And I died in the dream. I died. But once I died in the dream, I woke up in the altar of time. And it was like a round circle, like a clock made of stone. And I was like in some kind of temple. And I woke up from my death into this temple of time. And all the numbers were just there on the ground. And I woke up and a man came in. And I said, Father, why did you let me die? Why did you let them kill me? And it was the Father, it was the universe itself. It was God, you could call it God, but it was the universe, it was a consciousness. And he said to me, you're just one man. You cannot defeat evil. He said, you see, there gets a point to, once people acquire so much power, and they become evil, that the evil can only accelerate and it can only become even more extreme and it has no end. And then he said, let me show you. And then we got on this cloud. There was like a small cloud on the ground and we hopped on it and he had a staff and we flew out. We were like in this the temple of time. And we flew out in the sky and then we came to Earth. So I was not in Earth. I was coming from somewhere else. And then we got to Earth, but we didn't go into Earth. God or the consciousness, whatever it was, it showed me the planet Earth and said, look at what they've done. And I saw the powerful, the super rich, and they were just taking over the world. There was just people being killed and murdered, and they were basically just consolidating power. The rich decided not to compete against each other anymore. An age had arrived in which they didn't need the common man, and so they were just clearing the world of the common man, because the rich wanted to build a world in which they could all be Caesar. They wanted that kind of power. They wanted the power of a god. They wanted to rule as if they were human gods. Ubermensch, human gods. And so the lesson that I took was that I cannot defeat them alone. The lesson was you cannot do this alone. You need help. You need people. You need others. So I'm entering the game, looking for like-minded individuals, trying to find out if I'm crazy or I am indeed the return of Zarathustra, Nietzsche's fictional character who comes to the world with the philosophy of the future in a bid to save humanity. I guess we shall soon see.